Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
When the death sentence was officially given, Ramirez finally addressed the court, reading a statement in which he claimed to be beyond good and evil and vowed to be avenged. A glimpse into Ramirez's mind and his complete lack of remorse for his crimes.
Big deal. Death always went with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking they still haunt our imaginations.
True Criminals Insiders.
If you're following us on Patreon, thank you. And there'll be an exclusive extra chat about today's True Criminal following the main episode. In episode 32 of True Criminals, we explored the story of the Night Stalker, a wave of apparently unrelated killings in California back in 1984 and 1985, which police proved was the work of one serial murderer, Richard Ramirez. The case sent shockwaves through Los Angeles and San Francisco, with victims seemingly picked at random, men, women, the young and the elderly. Ramirez was eventually convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, and multiple counts of rape and burglary. Despite those convictions, it's thought he may have killed and assaulted many more, including kidnapping multiple children. We heard how finally, on August the 31st, 1985, Ramirez was arrested. So in this episode, we pick up the story of what happened next. We'll examine Richard Ramirez's trial, incarceration and death, and how public fear turned to morbid fascination with this unusual and satanic serial killer. We'll be talking to psychologist Dr. Amanda Vicary about the phenomenon of a serial killer who developed a large fan base. Some identified as Satanists, others were fascinated with how someone could commit such heinous crimes. Some believed he was innocent, and then there was a large following of women who were interested in Ramirez on a sexual and even romantic level. But before we explore some of that kind of weirdness, Martin, let's talk about the psychology of the killer himself. At the end of August 1985, now that detectives had him in custody, what did they unearth and discover about his background?
They discovered that his background was a pretty brutal one. Ramirez was born in El Paso, Texas, and his childhood was marked by violence and dysfunction. His father, ironically, was a former police officer, but he was severely abusive. Psychiatrist Michael Stone describes Ramirez as a made psychopath, as opposed to a born psychopath. He says that Ramirez's schizoid personality disorder contributed to his indifference to the suffering of his victims. Stone said Ramirez was knocked unconscious and almost died on many occasions before he was 6 years old, and as a result of that, quotes, later developed temporal lobe epilepsy, aggressivity, and hypersexuality. When he was a little older, Ramirez had a cousin, Miguel Mike Valles, who served in the Vietnam War and exposed him to violent and pornographic photos at a very young age. Ramirez said that he was fascinated by the gore and violence in these photos and that they had a profound impact on him. His cousin also taught him military skills that he would go on to use in his killing spree. Valles actually shot his second wife in the face when Ramirez was present.
When you talk about what he went through before he was even 6 years old, it's quite difficult, Martin, to listen to all that. And then, of course, there was Ramirez's involvement in Satanism. How did that play a role in his crimes?
He became involved in Satanism after he moved to LA in 1983. His favourite book was The Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey, which he often carried with him. Another was the biography of the serial killer Jack the Ripper. He got a witch's star tattooed on his elbow, and he told friends that Satan was his friend and hero. His crimes often featured satanic symbols and rituals, and he seemed to be driven by a desire to spread fear and chaos. He saw himself as an outsider, somebody who was above the law and beyond good and evil.
Despite the notoriety of the crimes that took place in the mid-80s, there was a lengthy delay before his trial began. I think it started on January the 30th, 1989. What was behind the delay, Martin?
Yeah, there was a gap of nearly 4 years between arrest and trial, which was due to the complexity of the case, the need for extensive forensic analysis, and the time it took for the prosecution to gather evidence and build a strong case against Ramirez. The trial cost $1.8 million, which at that time made it the most expensive murder trial in the history of California, until it was surpassed by the O.J. Simpson case in 1994.
In the US, of course, the wrangling between the prosecution and the defence starts even in the jury selection process. We've seen that many a times on TV dramas. How did the defence approach it?
Well, the defence hoped to get a jury with mostly Hispanics and minorities, believing that they might be more open-minded. They considered this a victory when the final jury was sworn in with 6 Hispanics and 6 African Americans. But tensions were high throughout the trial, with Ramirez repeatedly attempting to avoid coming to court and even threatening the prosecutors.
And what happened when the trial finally got underway?
The prosecution, which was led by Phil Halpin, presented a matter-of-fact opening statement outlining the series of crimes in chronological order. The defence, led by Daniel Hernandez, attempted to sow reasonable doubt, but their efforts were often met with objections from the prosecution, and Ramirez didn't help his own cause. During his trial, Ramirez often wore a satanic pentagram symbol on his hand, which he would flash to cameras and the crowd. He also had frequent outbursts in the courtroom, and he had to be forced to attend his hearings. His overall appearance, specifically the sunglasses and the looks he would give to the gallery, created quite a scene.
There was also a tragic incident, wasn't there, which cast somewhat of a shadow during the jury deliberations?
There was indeed. On August the 14th, 1989, 30-year-old Phyllis Singletree, a juror, failed to report for jury duty. That afternoon, her body was found in her apartment. She'd been severely beaten and shot 3 times. This caused, as you can imagine, an incredible amount of fear and public spectacle. The news of her murder quickly reached the media, and the murder of a juror in California's most famous serial murder trial made it huge news. Many of the jurors were worried that Ramirez himself was somehow responsible.
And was he?
Authorities quickly determined the killing was domestic in nature, so he wasn't. The victim's live-in boyfriend, James Melton, was identified and was tracked to a motel. As deputies approached the room, he appeared on the balcony and then shot himself in the head. Inside, police found a suicide note where he admitted to killing Phyllis in a domestic dispute. The relationship between the two was extremely abusive. Other jurors recalled Phyllis arriving at court with bruising and being overall worried and distracted throughout the trial.
The jury ultimately delivered a guilty verdict on all 46 counts. How did Ramirez react to that verdict?
He wasn't surprised. He claimed that the trial was a farce and he'd never be acquitted. He refused to attend the verdict reading. Instead, he heard it in a holding cell.
And what about the penalty hearing? How did the prosecution and defence approach that?
The prosecution laid out the brutality of each murder, urging the jury to choose justice and vote for the death penalty. The defence, on the other hand, spoke of mercy and highlighted the people Ramirez let live, and they argued that a life sentence would be a severe punishment.
But the mercy line didn't go anywhere with the judge, did it? He wasn't buying it.
No surprises, really. Ramirez was sentenced to death in the gas chamber. When the death sentence was officially given, Ramirez finally addressed the court, reading a statement in which he claimed to be beyond good and evil and vowed to be avenged. A glimpse into Ramirez's mind and his complete lack of remorse for his crimes. He said, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland."
Serial killers, they are a product of the times, and these are bloodthirsty times.
I've covered a death row story, and I remember from that often people who are sentenced to death spend a lot of time on death row, many, many years. What happened to Ramirez in this case after the trial?
Well, much like those others, he remained on death row at San Quentin State Prison until his death on June the 7th, 2013. But he didn't die by execution. He had cancer, B-cell lymphoma. He was 53 by then.
I think we're left with many disturbing things in this case, but one of them is the cult status that surrounds Ramirez. Despite him being convicted of these horrific crimes, it didn't seem to put off an awful lot of, well, I don't know whether you call them fans, did it?
Well, there were certain people who became obsessed with him, and a lot of them were women. His charisma and good looks seemed to play a role in his cult status. It's said he received lots of letters from women admirers. One woman who developed an infatuation, perhaps even an obsession with him, was Cindy Hayden. She was an alternative juror who made her way to the main jury and even cast a vote to sentence Ramirez to death. She admitted that she developed feelings for him during the trial, and afterwards she quit her job to start a new career just to be closer to him.
I always find stories like that very difficult to understand, but we're going to find out a bit more about that a little later in this episode with our guest. But then, of course, there was Doreen Loy, the woman who actually married Ramirez in 1996 when he was behind bars. How did Doreen Loy begin a relationship with him?
Well, Doreen Loy was one of us, a journalist. She was a magazine editor who became fascinated with Ramirez's case after his arrest. She began writing him letters and visiting him in prison before his trial, and eventually she became engaged to him in 1989. She claimed that she didn't believe Ramirez was responsible for the deaths, despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. For many years before Ramirez's death, Loy said she would commit suicide when Ramirez was executed.
And their wedding was a surreal event, with Ramirez refusing to wear a gold wedding band because, quote, Satanists don't wear gold. What do you think, or what idea have you got, Martin, of what drove Loy's fascination with Ramirez?
Difficult to say for certain. She described feeling a connection with him after seeing his picture on TV, and it's clear that Loy was drawn to Ramirez's charismatic personality and the sense of danger and excitement that surrounded him. Or did she simply seek fame? The relationship was controversial, some critics accusing her of being a serial killer groupie.
Well, to discuss Loy's relationship with Ramirez and the morbid celebrity of serial killers in American culture, we're joined by Dr. Amanda Vicary, a social psychologist and professor of psychology at Illinois Wesleyan University.
Her research focuses on true crime, criminal behaviour, and the psychology behind why people, especially women, are drawn to stories of violent crime.
Dr. Vicary's work's been featured in publications like the New York Times, the Atlantic magazine, and National Public Radio, making her a leading voice on the intersection of psychology, media, and our cultural obsession with crime. Amanda, welcome to True Criminals.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. What initially drew you to study women's interest in true crime and murderers?
Well, whether I should admit it or not, it was from my own personal interest. So growing up, my mom gave me a true crime book when I was 12 years old, which was highly inappropriate and makes me still question her parenting to this day. But I was drawn to it. And so I would be the kid in high school, this was back before cell phones, where I would have the paperback book under the desk reading about murder while my teacher is talking about something entirely else. And so when I ended up in graduate school studying psychology, I was originally focused on romantic relationships and how people's upbringing affected who they were attracted to. And one day I said to my advisor, I'm really interested in true crime. And he said, my wife is into that stuff. And I said, so is my mom. And it hit me. And I thought, is this just a woman thing? What is this? And that started my career studying people's interest in crime, which eventually turned into attraction to the killers themselves.
You know, Amanda, I've read somewhere that up to 95% of true crime consumers are women. From your research, what are the most common psychological reasons that some women, a lot of women perhaps, seem to be drawn to violent men?
Right. And it's strange because when you think about true crime and the stories and the people involved, you would think it would be distasteful, especially to the stereotypical, more sweet-natured woman compared to a man, right? Why would we want to go to bed at night listening to podcasts of people being murdered? It's odd. And what I found in my research is there's a couple elements of these true crime stories that really draw women in. They really like it when there's some sort of psychological content being talked about, like what set the killer off or what in his background caused him to kill. Or if they can learn something from the stories, like if someone escaped, did they use some sort of clever trick? And when you look at these together, you see they're related to survival. And so research shows that women have a great fear of crime, especially compared to men. And you can see that in your daily life. Who's scared to walk down the street at night? Usually women. And this fear of crime is almost driving people to consume more of these stories as a way to learn how to keep these things from happening to themselves. If we learn, how did this woman get killed, we can try to take steps to keep it from happening to us.
It's such a fascinating topic and interesting that your interest was sparked from the 12-year-old you. From all your studies, can you give us a sense of what the distinction is between women who are fascinated by true crime as a genre and those who become perhaps more romantically fixated on the perpetrators?
Yeah. And so it's interesting because as long as true crime has been a thing, we have seen women interested in these killers, right? Going back even to the early 1900s. And then, of course, we have Ted Bundy, Richard Ramirez, then we have Scott Peterson, Chris Watts. Every couple of years, there's a new killer in the news that is getting all of these letters from adoring fans. And I think the interest for some women does start with a fascination with true crime in general. But for these famous killers, a lot of it has to do with the simple fact that they are famous. And so there's potentially a deeper subconscious reason for this. Back in our ancestral hunter-gatherer environment, women needed a man to help them survive, right? To hunt the food, to protect them from predators. And a lot of research has shown that the things that people would have been attracted to back then are still with us today, almost subconsciously driving what we're interested in. And so even though women don't really need a man to take care of them anymore, this idea of a man providing protection and resources is something that is still appealing to a lot of women. And so it seems silly to think of a serial killer as providing resources, but fame is linked to status, right? We see someone famous like a celebrity. We think in the back of our minds, they're rich, they're powerful. And it's likely that we look at these serial killers who are getting all this attention and think the same way, that they are powerful, that they are important. And our conscious mind doesn't really make the distinction that this is how they got this fame and celebrity in a way that is dangerous. And so it's the fame itself, the attention, the power itself that attracts some women to these famous killers.
I'm sure, Amanda, there are other factors at play. And here we're talking about a serial killer who attracted women more than many other serial killers. I just wondered, what role do you think the media, heaven forbid, and pop culture has in fueling that appeal of people like Ramirez?
Well, we can see it even more so in recent years when you look at Netflix or other platforms creating these even fictional versions of these stories. So Zac Efron is playing Ted Bundy. Women are watching the show and feeling an attraction to Ted Bundy, even though it's maybe more so Zac Efron. And this has been known to happen before. And so the more the media covers these serial killers and produces these shows on them and whatnot, the greater celebrity and status they seem to have, which is going to impact people even more so. So we're exposing more women to these men. And in some cases, we may be glamorizing them, depending on how the content is produced.
What do you think it was about Richard Ramirez in particular that made him such a cult figure for, well, quite a lot of women?
Yeah, that's a mystery, right? Because when I think back to all of the true crime books I've read or podcasts I've listened to, he's one of the few that really creeps me out more than any of the others. Just the randomness of his crimes and the viciousness of it. Of anyone, you would think he would not be attractive to women. So I think there's a few different things there. One, I hope this doesn't make me sound bad. Objectively, he wasn't a bad looking guy, right? He was a reasonably attractive guy. So I'm sure that that helped. He received a lot of attention, a lot of coverage, from the crimes to the way he was eventually arrested by the citizens. This is a great, compelling story. He had this persona, he had an aura about him. He was into Satan. He was cocky. He was arrogant. And apparently some people were drawn to that. Now, I've seen in interviews or read that Doreen, who eventually married him, believed in his innocence. And so that is especially interesting because the majority of women that I have talked to over the years and interviewed who have fallen in love with men in prison, the men are pretty open that they committed the crimes, and the women know that they committed the crimes, and they've come to accept that. They're okay with that. And so it seems like part of her interest was believing that maybe he was this poor, innocent hurt by the justice system. And whether she truly believed that deep down, it's hard to say, but I think that that helped her justify being with him.
Our podcast, True Criminals, is almost a year old. Thank you to all those on Patreon and to our listeners who followed us over the year and heard stories that have ranged from serial killers like Fred West and Myra Hindley to ongoing mysteries like the disappearance of Madeleine McCann and Lord Lucan, to robbers including Playboy thief Valerio Vice and Great Train mastermind Bruce Reynolds. As a Christmas special, we want to answer your questions about our previous episodes. Ask us anything you want, and Martin and I will try to answer. Send us your thoughts to contact@audiobleachglobal.com.
Falling for somebody in prison, a notorious prisoner, or even having sympathy for them, I guess some people will understand, but Doreen Loy went so much further and actually married Ramirez. What might explain, do you think, that level of devotion to somebody so violent and dangerous?
Well, when I talk to women who have married the everyday average prisoner that they found, say, on writeaprisoner.com, someone who hasn't committed something quite as vicious as Richard Ramirez, I ask them the same question. I say, why get married at all? Why not wait until he got out? Why not keep dating from behind bars? And they all say the same thing. They say, because of love. I love him just like people on the outside love their partner. And I wanted to show the world that love. Now, there are more logistical reasons for getting married too. The women can be informed if something happens to their husband behind bars, say he got hurt or injured. If she's not married, she might not find out that information, but she would have access to that. And then it gives her more status to the outside world. If she's the type of woman that wants to go on shows and talk about her relationship like Doreen did, being able to say she's married to him gives her some more status as well.
And from these women, Amanda, that you've spoken to, do you get a sense that sometimes maybe trauma or perhaps low self-esteem or maybe a history of abusive relationships has perhaps made people romanticize or obsess over somebody like Ramirez?
Yeah, you've hit the so-called stereotypes right on the head. And it's interesting because I've talked to probably 50 women now who've married or seriously dated men in prison. And it really just is a wide variety of reasons that women get into this. And it's true that a lot of them have had some sort of troubled upbringing, often with fathers who are absent. But it may not be the case that they have these so-called daddy issues or they're trying to replace the father. It may be as simple as a socioeconomic thing where they have ended up in a poor economic class. And so they're around people who've been to prison more. Prison is not as scary or as intimidating to them. Some women do mention low self-esteem. But what's interesting is they've never had trouble finding men on the outside either. Every woman I talk to has either been married before or has been in serious relationships. They are not these women who are so unattractive and depressed that they can't find someone. Most of the women who end up in these relationships, not with the famous killers, just with the average everyday prisoners, just sort of fell into it. Like they reached out as a show of support for someone and then eventually fell in love. I think it is a very distinct group of women who are seeking out the famous killers like the Chris Watts and the Richard Ramirez and Scott Petersons of the world. And they seem to be driven more by perhaps fame and attention seeking than other women.
Who exactly do you think they fall in love with? Is their infatuation more to do with fantasy rather than reality?
In the case of the famous killers, for sure, I've read through many letters that were sent to Chris Watts, who was convicted of killing his wife and 2 young daughters in Colorado back several years ago. And some of the women say, I've watched all your TV interviews. They see this good-looking, buff guy who's portraying himself as being devastated of the loss of his family, even though he was responsible for it. And it's like any celebrity you see on TV. You don't know what they're really like. And a lot of times that's why some of these relationships, even with the average day prisoners, tend to fall apart once they're released. You can't fully know what someone is going to be like on the outside when you're just talking to them on the phone or visiting them in prison once a week.
Amanda, how common is that dynamic among people who fall for incarcerated killers? That infatuation and whether it's reality or fantasy?
Well, I think it's important to make a distinction between women who are writing to men that say they work with someone and their coworker is like, hey, my son is in prison. Do you want to write him a letter? Or women who find someone on writeaprisoner.com versus the women who are writing to the Richard Ramirez's of the world. And for the women who are writing to the famous killers like the Ted Bundys or the Richard Ramirez's, they are definitely driven by this idea of the celebrity, this status, this fantasy that either this person is innocent and I'm going to be the sole person who believes in him and can give him that support. Think how powerful that would make you feel. And also this idea of if they believe he really is responsible for the crimes, that he would hurt all these people, but I know the real him. He would never hurt me. And whether that's true or not, who knows?
One wonders what's in it for the prisoners themselves. Obviously, there's a lot of attention, but thinking of the marriage for Ramirez, presumably, I'm guessing it couldn't be consummated, for example. What's in it for him?
Oh, for the men, having a partner on the outside is everything, regardless of what they're in for or how long they're in for. First of all, just having someone to come visit them, getting out of your cell to go to the visiting room and eat snacks from the vending machine is a huge deal. Second, a lot of these women will provide financial support, even if it's not a lot, even just $25 a month on their books in prison can help them buy coffee or snacks or new toothbrushes that they might not have access to. And then having someone working on their case from the outside, whether it's trying to prove his innocence or trying to get him resources to help him earn parole or get a sentence overturned. For men, the benefits are endless to a relationship like this.
Doreen Loy's obsession and her belief in Ramirez's innocence did come to an end. She stuck with it through his convictions and his death sentence, but there came a point when she appeared to change her mind and began distancing herself from him. In 2009, he was linked by DNA evidence to the sex assault and murder of a 9-year-old girl. Do you think that could have been what changed her opinion of Ramirez?
It's hard to say. Look at everything else he was convicted of. Why would this be the one that would send her over to the edge? I can't do this anymore, unless it was the DNA that she couldn't deny it anymore. But usually when people are in that much of disbelief, I've talked to a woman who is married to a man who has been linked to his crimes via DNA, and she has just convinced herself that the DNA was planted, that it's not real. So my guess would be that there was something else going on in the relationship. Maybe this was a straw that broke the camel's back. Maybe she started to see his real personality. Maybe he was losing interest in her and wanted to move on to a younger version. Guys like these are still getting letters, even if they're married. Maybe he found a better option, and this was her way to save face by implying that it was because of the new findings.
From all the research and the conversations that you've had, Amanda, do you see any patterns that emerge among the prison wives who do eventually fall out of their infatuation or whatever it is?
That's a really good question. For a lot of the women I've spoken with, they have stayed with their men until they get out, or they are still with him and they are still incarcerated. There's only a few that I have spoken with where the relationship fell apart while the man was still behind bars. And some of these women go on to date another prisoner. But I have found a few that said, I'm done with this. This is just too hard. I never want to do this again. As to what drives them to finally make that distinction, I'm honestly not sure.
You think sometimes podcasters like us are at fault? And I mean by that, do you think there's a danger in how some true crime media portrays killers like Ramirez?
Well, I think there's a wide variety of the content we hear on podcasts or we see on TV shows. Some podcasts are just totally sensational, right? I've read reports of them playing graphic audio of people being killed, or there's almost this worship of killers, versus ones that are more news-like or providing factual information. I think true crime can be done very sensitively. Oftentimes, the victims' families or their loved ones are part of it. Look at the shows that are focused on wrongful convictions or trying to solve unsolved cases. True crime can do some good out there. Are there some bad apples in the bunch? Of course. And do they sometimes play up this sensationalism? I mean, look at the coverage in America of Luigi Mangione and all the attention that he has received. Is that contributing to some sort of obsession coming from women? Probably. But I think a lot of true crime can be done ethically as well.
I'd like to think that True Criminals is done sensitively and ethically and certainly isn't sensationalized. There's no need for that when you look at the stories that we cover. But I suppose, following on from Martin's question, what responsibility do you think that creators in the true crime space have when telling stories like Ramirez's story, and particularly regarding the attention these killers receive?
It's difficult, right? It helps when you have the loved ones of the victims have spoken publicly or are a part of it. It can be important not to portray his crimes in any glamorized manner. I was thinking about this a lot in the book that I have coming out next year on these women marrying men in prison. And some of the women have married these famous killers. I have made the decision not to post any pictures in the book of just the killer himself, just for no reason other than so we can see what he looks like and see how cute he is, right? And I specifically did not put in any pictures of the victims because this is not their story. I don't want to offend them by including their information on a book about their loved one's murder or finding love with someone on the outside. And so you can try to take steps to mitigate this sensationalism to some degree.
You mentioned that you're in the process at the moment of writing a book. Tell us a bit more about the book and what's driven you to write it.
Well, I started this as part of my dissertation many, many years ago, doing lab studies on women attractions to criminals. And I realized that trying to do a mass survey of women who write to prisoners was not going to work because these women are a private bunch, a lot of them, despite what TikTok may tell you. And they don't want to talk about their backgrounds to random people or random survey on the internet and feel like people are judging them. And so I realized I really needed to talk to these women one-on-one and then try to gain their trust. And once I did that, I stayed in touch with many of these women for a decade or more. And I realized I had these collections of amazing stories, women where their men had gotten out. Are they still together or not? Or what about the ones who found out their men were cheating behind bars? What did they do? And so the book is a collection of their stories with the psychological context weaved in there. Like, why did this woman end up doing this? Or what are some of the reasons for this? With one chapter being on the fame and the famous killers. A woman who became engaged to Danny Rolling, known as the Gainesville Ripper, is featured in that chapter.
Amanda, we will all look forward to reading that book.
It's been a pleasure to have you on True Criminals. And just tell us before you go, if our listeners want to follow your work and find out more about what we've talked about today, where can they find you?
On Instagram, I am under Dr. Amanda Vicary. And on Facebook, if you look Amanda Vicary author, you will find my Facebook page. And when the book's publication date and title are announced, that's where those will be.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you very much for joining us.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Martin, we've covered some gruesome crimes, including serial killer stories like Fred and Rose West, which we spoke about in our first True Criminals episodes. Listening to Amanda, and from your knowledge and extensive experience in true crime, why do you think pop culture fixates on serial killers like the Wests or Ramirez in America in popular crime novels and TV series? And what does it say really about our society?
I think it's quite hard to explain. Some people seem fascinated by the thrill and the horror of these crimes, the gruesome details. And you mentioned Fred and Rose West. Remember Howard Soons, the Fred and Rose West book author, who came in on previous podcasts. I remember him telling me that he was always getting calls, letters from women, some of them he met at functions, who used to love telling him how they would go to bed all snuggled up with Fred and Rose. The most extraordinary details in his books, but they seem to be getting a really scary thrill from it. And of course, there are others who are interested in them as an expression of darker aspects of human nature. It's a dilemma when you come to cover something like this. For all of us, I think of all the books, the articles, the podcasts like ours, sometimes featuring serial killers. And I guess we have to ask ourselves the question, are we glorifying them or normalizing them?
Certainly a reminder of the darkness which exists in human nature, and interesting to hear an expert like Dr. Amanda Vicary saying that her own fascination with true crime started through her mum as a young girl when she was just 12, and then she's gone on obviously to study the psychology behind it all. Interesting stuff, I thought, from Amanda.
Yes, and she touched on something that we've discussed before about why so many women are particularly interested in true crime. And she acknowledged, like others have, that sometimes there's this survival instinct, and it might be conscious or subconscious, that women particularly need to know how, why and where violent crime happens so they can protect themselves against it.
Yeah, interesting when she talked about survival there. Martin, another fascinating episode. Thank you, and thank you, listeners, for joining us in this exploration of a very disturbing case. Welcome to our new Patreon followers. Thank you for joining. Just to remind listeners, if you want to hear the episodes ad-free, you can. Head over to patreon.com/True Criminals. Stay with us for 3 months at Patreon and we'll send you a free True Criminals mug. Martin and I haven't even got one of those yet. Your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Research for this episode was conducted by Becca Stinton. Follow True Criminals on Instagram @true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.